Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The perceived invincibility of the German defensive systems during the latter half of the Second World War remains one of the most enduring myths of military history, a myth carefully cultivated by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine and inadvertently reinforced by the sheer scale of the engineering projects undertaken by the Todt organization. To the casual observer in early 1944, the Third Reich had transformed the European continent into an impenetrable fortress, a Festung Europa, girded by thousands of tons of reinforced concrete, massive coastal batteries, and millions of mines. However, beneath this formidable aesthetic lay a crumbling reality defined by systemic failures in command, a catastrophic lack of strategic depth, the total erosion of logistical capacity, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the changing nature of modern, combined arms warfare. The failure of German defenses was not the result of a single tactical error but was rather a cascading series of structural collapses that rendered even the most impressive fortifications little more than static targets for the overwhelming industrial and aerial might of the Allied powers. To understand why these defenses failed so spectacularly despite their outward strength, one must first examine the Atlantic Wall, the centerpiece of Hitler's defensive strategy in the West. Spanning from the North Cape of Norway to the Spanish border, the wall was envisioned as a continuous line of fortifications that would deny the Allies a foothold on the continent. However, the sheer geography of the task made the concept of a continuous wall a strategic impossibility. The German military simply did not have the manpower or the materials to fortify every kilometer of the coastline to the same degree. Consequently, the defense was concentrated in strongpoints and fortress ports, leaving vast stretches of the coast protected by nothing more than thin wire and occasional patrols. This created what historians often call a thin crust defense. Like a hollow eggshell, the Atlantic Wall was remarkably hard on the surface but contained no substance within. Once the shell was pierced at a few critical points, such as the beaches of Normandy, there were no secondary or tertiary lines of defense prepared to contain the breach. The Germans had invested so heavily in the forward defense at the water's edge that they lacked the defense in depth that had characterized their successful operations earlier in the war. The systemic failure of the defense was further exacerbated by a paralyzing conflict at the highest levels of command regarding the proper doctrine for repelling an invasion. This debate, primarily between Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander of Army Group B, represented a fundamental schism in German military thought. Rundstedt, a practitioner of traditional Prussian maneuver warfare, believed that a landing could not be stopped at the beaches. His strategy was to hold the bulk of the panzer divisions in a central, mobile reserve deep inland, allowing the Allies to land and then launching a massive, coordinated counter-offensive to drive them back into the sea once their main line of advance was identified. Rommel, drawing on his bitter experiences in North Africa where Allied air power had decimated his columns, argued that any movement of armored reserves during the day would be impossible under the weight of Allied aerial supremacy. He insisted that the panzers be stationed immediately behind the beaches to crush the invasion in its first few hours. Hitler, in his typical fashion, chose a compromise that managed to combine the weaknesses of both plans while retaining the strengths of neither. He split the panzer divisions, placing some under Rommel's direct control near the coast and keeping the most powerful units in a strategic reserve, Panzer Group West, that could only be released with his personal permission. On June 6, 1944, this system resulted in total paralysis. While the Allied forces were struggling on the beaches, the most potent German counter-strike forces sat idle, waiting for a Führer who was asleep and whose staff was too terrified to wake him. By the time the orders were finally issued, the Allied air forces had established such a dominant presence over the Normandy skies that the German armored columns were slaughtered on the roads before they could even reach the front. This leads to the second pillar of systemic failure, the total collapse of the Luftwaffe and the resulting death from above that neutralized German defensive structures. A fortification, no matter how thick its concrete, is a static object. In the age of total air superiority, a static object is a target. The Allied transportation plan, in the months leading up to D-Day, systematically destroyed the French railway network, bridges, and fuel depots, effectively isolating the coastal defenses from their sources of supply and reinforcement. The German logistical machine, which was still heavily dependent on horse-drawn transport for its infantry divisions, found itself unable to move. The German defenders at the Atlantic Wall were often static divisions in more than just name. They lacked the trucks and fuel necessary to reposition themselves once the Allied intent became clear. Furthermore, the qualitative decline of the German infantry was profound. Many of the divisions manning the coastal defenses were B-class units composed of the very young, the very old, or Osttruppen, conscripted prisoners from the Eastern Front whose loyalty to the Nazi cause was non-existent. When faced with the highly trained, well-equipped, and air-supported Allied assault troops, these static units often collapsed or surrendered after only token resistance, regardless of the quality of their concrete bunkers. On the Eastern Front, the failure of German defenses followed a different but equally systemic pattern. Here, the failure was rooted in Hitler's no-retreat policy, the infamous Haltbefehl. As the Red Army grew in sophistication, adopting the doctrine of deep battle, the German army remained wedded to a rigid defense of every inch of territory. This rigidity played directly into Soviet hands. During Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944, the Red Army did not just attack the German front lines. They bypassed strongpoints and launched massive pincer movements that encircled entire German armies. Because Hitler refused to allow his generals to conduct a flexible defense, which would have involved trading space for time and retreating to more defensible river lines, German divisions were repeatedly trapped in cauldrons, Kessel, and annihilated. The destruction of Army Group Center during Bagration saw the loss of nearly 30 divisions and 400,000 men, a catastrophic blow that was a direct result of the systemic failure to adapt defensive strategy to the reality of Soviet numerical and operational superiority. The German defenses looked strong on maps, with lines clearly drawn across the steppes of Russia and the forests of Belarus, but those lines were often manned by depleted units with no reserves behind them and no permission to move until it was too late. Technological over-engineering also played a significant role in the systemic failure. The German obsession with quality over quantity led to the production of formidable weapons like the Tiger and Panther tanks, which were individually superior to almost anything the Allies possessed. However, these machines were mechanical nightmares, prone to breakdowns and requiring specialized maintenance that the collapsing German logistical system could not provide. In a defensive war of attrition, reliability and ease of production are more valuable than peak performance. While the Germans spent thousands of man-hours building a single, complex Tiger, the Soviets and Americans were churning out T-34s and Shermans by the tens of thousands. The German defense was systematically overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Allied production. On the ground, this meant that even if a German anti-tank gun destroyed 5 Allied tanks, there were 5 more waiting to take their place, while the German gun, once its position was spotted, would be obliterated by a swarm of fighter bombers or a barrage of heavy artillery. The German Festung, fortress, strategy, implemented late in the war, was perhaps the ultimate expression of this systemic failure. Hitler designated various cities, such as Cherbourg, St. Nazaire, and later Breslau and Königsberg, as fortresses, to be held to the last man. The theory was that these fortresses would tie down large numbers of Allied troops and deny them the use of vital ports or transport hubs. In practice, the Allies simply bypassed many of these fortresses, leaving them to wither on the vine while the main armies raced toward the heart of Germany. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, including many of their best remaining units, were effectively removed from the war, trapped in isolated pockets where they could contribute nothing to the defense of the fatherland. The fortress strategy did not prolong the war, it merely ensured that the eventual collapse would be more sudden and more total, as the German army bled itself white defending strategically irrelevant enclaves. The intelligence failure of the German High Command also cannot be overlooked. The success of Allied deception operations, such as Operation Fortitude, ensured that the German defensive effort was misdirected. For weeks after the landings at Normandy, the German leadership remained convinced that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. This resulted in the 15th Army, one of the most powerful German units in the West, sitting idle in northern France while the 7th Army was being decimated in the hedgerows of Normandy. This failure was systemic because it stemmed from the top-down, authoritarian nature of the Nazi regime, where intelligence was often manipulated to tell the Führer what he wanted to hear, and where the lack of a centralized, independent intelligence agency led to constant friction and misinformation between the Abwehr and the SD. Ultimately, German defenses failed because they were designed for a war that no longer existed. The German military excellence of 1939 to 1941 was built on aggression and maneuver, not on the static defense of an overextended empire. When forced onto the defensive, the Reich lacked the resources, the air cover, and the strategic flexibility to survive. The massive bunkers and coastal guns were symbols of a regime that mistook engineering for strategy and propaganda for reality. They were strong in appearance but brittle in practice, a system of defense that was fundamentally disconnected from the logistical and industrial realities of 1944. As the Allied armies advanced from both the east and the west, they did not just break through lines of concrete and steel. They shattered a military system that had been hollowed out by years of attrition, poor leadership, and a delusional belief in the power of the will over the hard facts of supply and fire supremacy. The collapse was systemic because the very ideology that fueled the German war machine, the obsession with total control, the refusal to retreat, and the cult of personality surrounding Hitler, was the same force that ensured its defensive structures would be unable to adapt to the crushing weight of the Allied onslaught. The depth of this failure is even more apparent when analyzing the West Wall or Siegfried Line. Originally built in the late 1930s, it had been largely stripped of its armaments and equipment to bolster the Atlantic Wall. When the Allies approached the German border in the autumn of 1944, the West Wall was a ghost of its former self. The bunkers were often too small for modern anti-tank guns, the communication lines had rotted, and the Dragon's Teeth tank obstacles were easily breached by specialized engineering vehicles. The frantic attempt to reactivate these defenses in late 1944 was a testament to the reactive and desperate nature of the German High Command. They were constantly fighting the last battle, trying to patch holes in a sinking ship with nothing but slogans and substandard materials. The individual bravery of the German soldier, who often fought with a tenacity born of desperation and indoctrination, could not compensate for a system that had failed him at every level of planning and execution. The failure of German defenses was the failure of a worldview that overestimated the power of fortification and underestimated the power of the integrated, industrial, and democratic war machine that was arrayed against it. By late 1944, the structural integrity of the German defense was further compromised by the sheer exhaustion of its human capital. The system had reached its breaking point. The loss of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers meant that the tactical flexibility, the Auftragstaktik, that had once been the hallmark of the German army was gone. New replacements were often sent into battle with only a few weeks of training, and the cohesion of the units suffered accordingly. This qualitative collapse meant that even when the Germans had the advantage of terrain or fortification, they were unable to exploit it. Defensive positions were often abandoned prematurely or held so rigidly that they were easily outflanked. The systemic failure had permeated down to the very squad level. The German defensive machine had become a lumbering and coordinated beast, capable of occasional bursts of violence but incapable of a sustained, effective resistance. Furthermore, the destruction of the German synthetic oil industry by Allied bombing meant that the mobility required for any modern defense was a fantasy. Tanks were often towed to the front by horses to save fuel, and once they reached their positions, they were used as static pillboxes. A tank that cannot move is not a tank. It is a very expensive and poorly armored bunker. This lack of fuel was the final nail in the coffin of the German defensive system. It rendered all the strategic debates about mobile reserves and pincer movements moot. The German army was a modern force that had been forced back into the 19th century, while its opponents were utilizing the full potential of the 20th. The failure of German defenses, therefore, was not just a military defeat, it was a technological and industrial eclipse. The strong defenses of the Third Reich were the architecture of a dying empire, a hollow monument to a regime that had built its house on the sand of ideological fervor and military overreach. When the storm came, the house did not just fall, it disintegrated systematically, leaving behind nothing but the ruins of its own hubris. The environmental and geographical factors also played a role that the Germans failed to systematically address. In Normandy, the Bocage country, a labyrinth of thick hedgerows and narrow sunken lanes, offered a natural defensive advantage that the Germans utilized with great tactical skill. However, Even this was a localized success that failed to translate into a systemic victory. The Germans were so focused on the tactical defense of individual fields and lanes that they lost sight of the operational necessity of a coherent front. They allowed themselves to be pinned down in a war of attrition in the hedgerows, a type of combat that favored the side with the most artillery and air support. While the Germans were fighting for every hedge, the Allies were building the logistical base that would eventually allow them to break out and encircle the entire German 7th Army at the Falaise pocket. The strength of the Bocage defense was a trap. It convinced the German commanders that they were winning because they were inflicting high casualties, while in reality, they were losing their only mobile forces in a battle they could not hope to win. The systemic failure also manifested in the realm of naval defense. The Kriegsmarine surface fleet had been effectively neutralized early in the war, leaving the defense of the European coast entirely to the U-boats and the coastal batteries. However, the U-boats were increasingly ineffective against the sophisticated anti-submarine measures of the Allied navies, and the coastal batteries were easily suppressed by the massive firepower of the Allied battleships. On D-Day, the German naval response was practically non-existent. The system of coastal defense had completely ignored the necessity of maintaining even a modicum of naval presence to disrupt an invasion fleet. This allowed the Allies to land their millions of tons of supplies and millions of men with almost no interference from the sea. The Atlantic Wall, which was supposed to be a maritime barrier, was ultimately a land fortification that happened to be next to the ocean. In the final months of the war, as the fighting moved onto German soil, the national redoubt myth emerged. The idea that the Nazi leadership would retreat to the Bavarian Alps and wage a guerrilla war from an impregnable mountain fortress. This was the ultimate fake strength of the German defense. There was no redoubt, there were no supplies, no hidden armies, and no prepared fortifications. It was a phantom created by Allied intelligence fears and Nazi propaganda. The reality was that by 1945, there was nothing left to defend. The system had consumed itself. The industry was gone, the air was lost, the oil was exhausted, and the people were broken. The German defenses failed because they were the products of a system that believed its own lies. They looked strong because they were designed to look strong, to intimidate and to deceive. But in the final test of total war, they were found to be a massive, systemic failure, an object lesson in the futility of building walls when the foundation is already rotten. To provide a final, granular look at the systemic nature of this failure, we can examine the specific case of the 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach. On paper, this was one of the strongest German units in Normandy, and the defenses at Omaha were the most formidable of any of the D-Day beaches. The 352nd inflicted terrible casualties on the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. For several hours on the morning of June 6, it seemed as if the German defense at Omaha might actually succeed. However, even here, the failure was systemic. The 352nd was fighting in isolation. Because of the failure of the German command system, they received no reinforcements. Because of the failure of the Luftwaffe, they were relentlessly bombarded from the air and the sea. Because of the failure of the intelligence system, they were surprised by the timing and the scale of the assault. By the end of the day, despite their initial tactical success, the 352nd was a shattered unit, and the Americans had a firm foothold on the bluffs. Omaha Beach shows that even when the German defensive system worked, as intended at the tactical level, it failed at the strategic level. Individual courage and well-placed machine guns could not stop the systematic unfolding of the Allied plan. The 352nd's struggle was a microcosm of the entire German war effort. A fierce, localized resistance that was ultimately meaningless in the face of a superior and more flexible global system of warfare. The failure of the German defenses also highlights the critical difference between fortification and defense. A fortification is a noun, a physical structure. Defense is a verb, an action. The Germans built great fortifications, but they lost the ability to conduct a successful defense. A successful defense requires mobility, communication, logistics, and air cover. By 1944, the German military had lost almost all of these active elements. They were left with the passive elements, the concrete and the mines. But passive defense is always doomed to failure against an active and resourceful attacker. The Allies did not have to knock down the Atlantic Wall, they just had to go through it, over it, and around it. The systematic failure of the German defenses was the inevitable result of a military philosophy that had become obsessed with the static and the monumental, forgetting that war is always a fluid and dynamic process. As we conclude this analysis, it is important to recognize that the strength of the German defenses was also a psychological construct. For the German people and many in the military, the belief in the Atlantic Wall and the invincibility of the Wehrmacht was a necessary shield against the reality of impending defeat. This psychological dependence on strength made the eventual collapse even more devastating. When the impenetrable walls were breached in a single day, the shock was profound. The systemic failure of the defenses was thus a psychological failure as well, a shattering of the myth that the Nazi regime could protect its subjects. The ruins of the bunkers that still dot the coast of Europe today are not monuments to military power, but to a profound misunderstanding of what truly constitutes strength in the modern world. True strength lies not in the thickness of concrete, but in the resilience of a nation's institutions, the flexibility of its leadership, and the integration of its economic and military might. In all these categories, the Nazi system was fundamentally flawed, and its defenses were the ultimate expression of that flaw. The German defensive failure was also deeply tied to the cult of the offensive that had dominated German military thinking for a century. The German officer corps was trained for the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war of rapid movement and encirclement. They were psychologically and doctrinally ill-equipped for a static, defensive war of attrition. This led to a constant, underlying desire to launch counterattacks even when they were tactically unwise. At Normandy, Mortain, and the Ardennes, the Germans wasted their remaining armored strength in futile offensive gambles rather than using those forces to conduct a disciplined, retreating defense that might have prolonged the war and allowed for a negotiated peace. This systemic bias toward the offensive, even in a defensive posture, was a primary driver of the German military's self-destruction. They were like a boxer who only knows how to throw punches and never learned how to block. Once they were tired and their opponent started hitting back, they had no way to survive. In the final assessment, the German defenses of World War II serve as a cautionary tale. They prove that engineering brilliance cannot compensate for strategic blindness, and that tactical skill cannot overcome a systemic collapse of logistics and air power. The strong defenses of the Third Reich were a facade, a terrifying and impressive facade, to be sure, but one that concealed a military and political system that was already in the process of disintegrating. The failure was systematic because it was built into the very nature of the regime itself. From the divided command structure to the obsession with wonder weapons and the refusal to face the reality of Allied industrial power, every part of the Nazi system contributed to the eventual failure of its defenses. When the history of the war is stripped of its myths, the image that remains is not one of a great wall being breached, but of a hollowed-out empire collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, its concrete bunkers standing as silent witnesses to a failure that was as total as it was inevitable. The structural weakness of the German defense was also visible in the way they handled their interior lines. In theory, the defender has the advantage of shorter lines of communication and the ability to move troops quickly between different fronts. However, the systematic destruction of the German infrastructure by Allied air power turned this advantage into a disadvantage. The German interior lines were constantly being severed, leaving units isolated and unable to support one another. The fortress of Germany became a trap where the defenders were unable to move, and the attackers were able to concentrate their forces at will. This was a systemic failure of the highest order, the turning of a fundamental military principle against the very people who were supposed to benefit from it. It was the final irony of the German defensive war: the more they fortified, the more they isolated themselves, and the easier it became for the Allies to destroy them piece by piece. The failure of German defenses was also a failure of their social and political system. The Nazi regime's reliance on slave labor to build its fortifications created a hidden weakness. The millions of forced laborers from across occupied Europe had no stake in the defense of the Reich. On the contrary, they did everything in their power to sabotage the work. There are countless reports of laborers intentionally weakening concrete mixes, misplacing reinforcements, or providing faulty information to their captors. This internal sabotage was a systemic byproduct of the regime's brutality. You cannot build a secure fortress with the hands of people who want to see it fall. The German defenses were undermined not just by Allied bombs, but by the very people the Germans had enslaved to build them. This human element was a critical, yet often overlooked, part of the systemic collapse. Looking at the Western Front again, the Lorraine Campaign in the autumn of 1944 provides another example of the systemic failure of German defenses. After the breakout from Normandy and the race across France, the Allied advance finally slowed as it hit the German border and the fortified city of Metz. The Germans had a chance to regroup and establish a new defensive line. However, the same systemic issues plagued them: a lack of fuel, a lack of air cover, and Hitler's constant interference. Hitler ordered a series of counterattacks with the newly formed panzer brigades, which were poorly trained and lacked the supporting infantry. These brigades were systematically destroyed by American tanks and anti-tank guns. Instead of using these valuable armored units to bolster the defense of the West Wall, Hitler threw them away in a futile attempt to regain the initiative. This recurring pattern of wasting precious resources on hopeless offensives was a defining characteristic of the German defensive failure. It was a failure of the system's ability to prioritize and to recognize its own limitations. In conclusion, the German defensive effort in World War II was a monumental undertaking that ultimately failed because it was built on a foundation of strategic, logistical, and political errors. The outward strength of the fortifications masked a profound internal weakness. The systemic nature of this failure means that it was not the result of any single person or event, but the inevitable outcome of the Nazi regime's approach to war and governance. The collapse of the German defenses was the collapse of a worldview that prioritized power over justice, appearance over reality, and the will of a dictator over the hard facts of the modern world. The ruins of the Atlantic Wall and the West Wall stand today as reminders of this failure, teaching us that true security cannot be built with concrete and steel alone, but must be rooted in a system that is flexible, realistic, and human. The code breakers and the logistics machine of the Allies were the intellectual and industrial counterparts to this systemic failure. While the Germans were building walls, the Allies were building the networks and systems that would render those walls obsolete. The history of the war is the history of the victory of a flexible, integrated system over a rigid, fragmented one, and the German defenses are the most visible and tragic symbol of that defeat. The failure of the German defenses in World War II was not a failure of individual bravery or engineering skill. It was a systemic collapse of a military and political architecture that had become disconnected from reality. The strength of the defenses was a facade that concealed a regime in its death throes. As we analyze the reasons for this failure, from the divided command and the lack of air cover to the logistical erosion and the no-retreat policy, we see a picture of a system that was unable to adapt to the crushing weight of a global, industrial war. The failure was total, and it was final. The story of the German defenses is the story of how a seemingly invincible power can be systematically dismantled when it loses the ability to think strategically, to move mobile and to support itself logistically. It is a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was in 1945. The strategic failure of the German defense was also a failure to understand the concept of total war. While the Allies fully mobilized their economies and societies for the conflict, the German regime was hesitant to do so until it was too late, fearing a collapse of domestic morale similar to that of World War I. This resulted in a situation where the German soldier was often fighting with superior equipment but in inferior numbers, supported by a home front that was being systematically dismantled by Allied bombing. The system of the Third Reich was not designed for the long haul, and its defenses were the first to feel the strain of this imbalance. The failure of the defenses was thus a reflection of the failure of the Nazi state to truly prepare for the consequences of its own aggression. It was a system built for the sprint, but it found itself in a marathon, and its lungs, the industry and the logistics, simply gave out. The final irony of the German defensive failure is that the very fortifications they built often became the instruments of their own destruction. Bunkers that were supposed to protect soldiers became tombs when they were surrounded and bypassed. Coastal guns that were supposed to sink ships were captured and turned against the retreating German columns. The static nature of the defense made it easy for the Allies to predict and neutralize. The German defensive system had become a Maginot Line of its own making, a massive investment in a form of warfare that the enemy had already learned how to defeat. The systemic failure was complete, and the lesson it teaches is clear. In the ever-evolving landscape of conflict, the only true defense is the ability to adapt, to innovate, and to remain connected to the realities of the world. The German defenses looked strong, but they failed systematically because they were the products of a regime that had forgotten these fundamental truths.